Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Wade Bradford and I am a writer and I also teach. I teach freshman composition and I also teach creative writing, and I've told my creative writing students that we are going to be examining Stephen King's book on writing, a memoir of the craft. And so what I'd like to do with this video is walk through about the first 50 pages or so and give you my thoughts and reflections on it. And if you have been reading this book as well, I would love to know what your favorite parts are, or least favorite parts. Full disclosure, I really admire Stephen King's creativity, and this book I think is a very valuable insight into how you can become more creative and more focused on your journey as a writer. So at the very beginning of the book, we get a few forewords where Stephen King is thanking people in his life. In particular, he thanks author Amy Tan for helping him come up with basically not the idea, but maybe come up with permission for doing this kind of book. He describes how he was a member of a little rock band made of different writers called the Rock Bottom Remainders. And Amy Tan is one of the singers in the group. He plays rhythm guitar. Mitch Albom plays on the keyboards. I need to look them up on YouTube to see if they sound any good. I would love to see them perform. So it's after one of these musical sessions where Stephen King is speaking with Amy Tan, asking, what kind of questions do you never receive when you're being interviewed? And Amy Tan says that no one ever asks her about the language. Most people, it seems, ask authors such as Stephen King and Amy Tan, where do you get your ideas? And Stephen King makes a big deal in his book and in several interviews that I've seen, talking about how that's kind of a lame question because he doesn't really know where he gets his ideas. He thinks of storytelling as sort of a form of discovery. So the ideas can come through the telling of the story when you're kind of trying to figure out the story as you're writing the first draft. And sometimes ideas just happen from out of nowhere, and a lot of times ideas are two or more things that come together to then make the so-called idea for your story. So he is big on the concept that ideas aren't kept in some magical storage facility. He says there's not an idea dump where you find the ideas. Ideas are happening all the time, and so it's up to you to recognize those ideas. So after the forewords, the first part of the book that we get to is the CV. If you think of resumes, applications, especially if you are going to be a professor at a college, they expect you to sort of list the qualities and qualifications that you have and let us know your experiences. And so what he is doing at the beginning of the book, in the first section, he is talking about his youth, starting with his childhood, going into his adolescence, into his early adult years. So I'm just going to walk through some of, I think, the more enlightening parts for me. And again, I'd love to know what struck a chord with you. A couple of the most fascinating parts that have to deal with his early memories are connected to the feeling of pain. So according to Stephen King, his earliest memory is when he is pretending to be a circus strong boy, and he is lifting up this big cinder block, and he's only 2 or 3 years old, and so he is imagining that he's this circus performer, and then all of a sudden a wasp stings his ear, and it's the most painful thing he's ever experienced, until a second later he accidentally drops the cinder block on his foot and mashes his toes, and that's now the new most painful experience. So I like to think that Stephen King is including this because he's letting us know, one, it's his earliest memory, and I'm fascinated by what our earliest memories are and whether they are funny or tragic or traumatic or a combination of all three. And so for Stephen King, his earliest memory has to do with a vivid imaginary experience, right? He's playing pretend, and then kind of a shocking, sudden, monstrous sort of pain, right? First caused by the wasp, and then caused by, an accident. That's not the only painful experience that he writes about. He also includes a darkly disturbing yet comic series of events with a babysitter named Beulah. And according to Stephen King, when he's just a boy, Beulah is the type of babysitter who will make him laugh, who will horse around and tickle him, and then all of a sudden smack him upside the head. She farts on his head. She makes him way too many eggs, first at his request and then kind of as a challenge, so that he eats so many fried eggs that he starts to throw up. And then she shoves him into a dark closet, locks him in there, falls asleep, while poor Stephen King is in the closet, still belching and throwing up. So if you've just heard that and you feel like, wow, I knew I didn't like Stephen King because he's gross, yeah, that's pretty gross stuff. But we're seeing what is shaping him as an author of these scary, creepy horror stories. Or sometimes in his work where it's not focused on horror, it's maybe more about traumatic events like the Shawshank Redemption, tales of prison, or sad stories like The Body, also known as the film Stand By Me. Stories that have a grotesque edge to them but are still rooted in reality. So Stephen King, I think, is dropping little clues as he's looking over his early life to let us know, basically he's letting us know in this book that strange things happened to him, and that those strange things stuck with him, and those are probably some of the roots of inspiration, if not for story ideas, at least for the tone and the style of stories that he often creates. So the concept of childhood pain culminates in this narrative in which Stephen King has high fever and the infection is affecting his ears. His mom takes him to the doctor, and the doctor basically says, hey, I need to stick a needle in here, but don't worry, it's not going to hurt at all. So Stephen King, as a little boy, trusts the doctor. The doctor puts the needle in the ear. It's intensely painful. He screams, he cries, he goes home thinking it's all over, and then less than a week later, he needs to go back to the doctor. The doctor says, don't worry, it's not going to hurt. Doctor does it again. Stephen experiences the pain again, cries again, screams again, and a week later he returns to the doctor, and this time he starts to fight. So he's going to scream and resist and fight back. So he comes up with the age-old idea of fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me, fool me a third time, he says, shame on both of us. And I think in addition to giving us another narrative where there's this traumatic childhood pain, he's also showing us this distrust for grown-ups, or in particular distrust for authority, which often is a recurring theme in some of his novels. Books like Firestarter has an evil organization that is bent on the manipulation of our society. There's a lot of that goes on in Stephen King's work. But if this was just an autobiography of Stephen King's painful childhood memories, the book really wouldn't be that useful. Of course, it's much more than that, and there are a lot of happy memories. And one of my favorite happy memories that Stephen King shows us is when he is writing his first story. So he's a little kid, and he's reading books and comic books and things like that, and juvenile literature, fun literature to read. And he decides, hey, I want to make something like that. So he basically writes a copy of one of the stories. And when his mom looks at it, she's, admiring his writing skills, but is basically saying, hey, you could write your own story. So he comes up with his own little story. And that story is about a magical rabbit and his 3 friends, and they travel around helping children. It sounds very pleasant, doesn't it? I'd love to read a copy of this. So his mom reads the story, is paying very close attention to the story, and then says, oh, Stevie, this is good enough to be in a book. And that level of admiration that his mom bestows upon him, that delights Stephen King, and probably is one of his defining moments as an author that wants to reach a lot of people. So his mom is not only his first audience member or first reader, but probably the person that he was most excited to connect with. That was probably the kind of experience where every other book that follows, he's probably kind of chasing that moment, remembering how wonderful it was to have his mom so proud of him. And not only proud, but his mom paid him 25 cents for each of these rabbit stories, each of these magical rabbit stories. So he wrote 4 of them, and that's how he made his first dollar. So for those of us who write, in particular for those of us who are new to writing and are maybe for the first time getting ready to send material out into the world, send out a query letter or a picture book or an entire novel manuscript or a screenplay, whatever it is that you might be sending, this is a good book to read because Stephen King gives some useful advice about rejection letters. So odds are, if you're sending your first manuscript out into the world, there's a very, very good chance that you are going to get rejected at least once, maybe dozens of times, maybe hundreds of times before you finally sell something, if you ever do sell something. So his first rejection letter that comes back is a standard form letter from the Alfred Hitchcock magazine, and so it's rejecting him, but there's something that's handwritten at the bottom, and the handwritten note says, "Don't staple your manuscripts." And he talks about how this is pretty, cold feedback, but he found it kind of useful, and he made a note of it and didn't staple his manuscripts after that. But really what I'm getting out of this moment is that if you get a rejection letter that's just obviously a standard response, that's not too useful. But if they add any sort of note or any sort of advice, that means that they're at least interested enough to try to help you, and that's a very good sign. So just having an editor tell Stephen King, hey, don't staple these, that was a little bit of, that was a rejection letter that had just a little bit of a personal touch. He talks about how he becomes a teenager and he writes more and more short stories and sends them off to different places, and that more and more he's getting personalized notes. So people are saying, oh, this is good, it's not for us, but submit again. So he's getting encouragement. So look for any form of encouragement in the rejection letters. Basically anything that's personalized is typically going to be a good sign. Another fun aspect of his adolescence is when he and his older brother start a little newspaper called Dave's Rag, and Stephen King's writing a serialized story, and he's also finding other ways to help with the printing process. And Stephen King talks about how he really doesn't care about the printing aspect or working on the photographs with his brother. He likes the writing, storytelling aspect, and that's what's fun. So that word is important, fun. Stephen King, as a young man, and I think as an adult, is looking for what's fun in writing, and that's probably something that we as creative writers should be doing. I don't think it's good for anyone to write something where if you feel like, well, I'm writing this because I think it will sell, or I'm writing this because this is really important and serious and I have to. I am more of the school of thought that you should be enjoying the process. Now, maybe fun is too trivial of a word, but it should be something that you look forward to, something that you enjoy doing, something that is not boring. If you are sitting and writing and you're very bored with the process, we are probably going to be very bored as readers. So look for the fun. Try to find what's fun about your own writing. We also see in his early teenage years that there are moments where he faces criticism and sometimes overcomes that sense of criticism, but sometimes that criticism prompts shame. When he's just a boy, he falls in love with movies, and no surprise, some of the creepy movies that are out in the 1950s are the ones that appeal to him the most. And there's a movie called The Pit and the Pendulum, based upon an Edgar Allan Poe short story. He watches that movie and he thinks, wow, what a great story. Somebody should write a novelized version of that movie, because he doesn't know that Edgar Allan Poe is the original author of it. So he writes an 8-page version of it and makes copies of it with the help of his brother's printing press, and then sells those copies to make a $9 profit from his chums at school. When the principal finds out about this, she says that the school is not a marketplace and basically criticizes him and the type of work that he has created. And Stephen King writes about how having someone say, oh, why are you wasting your talent writing this kind of dreck or schlock? And Stephen King talks about feeling kind of ashamed about that, and how that that shame lingers on, because of course many critics over the decades, especially early on in his highly successful career, many critics have said, oh, Stephen King, why is he seems talented, but why is he wasting his time writing these scary books? Why is this the genre he is writing in? Why can't he take his writing more seriously? And so I think that that he, at least according to this book, felt ashamed until he says when he turned around 40, he finally kind of got over that. So that's good advice. We should like what we like, as my daughter often has told me, that we should enjoy whatever kind of form of art we enjoy doing. We should not be ashamed of that. So if you like writing science fiction, if you like writing fantasy, if you like writing spooky stories, spy stories, cheesy romances, if you like writing fan fiction, comic books, whatever you enjoy writing, don't let other people stop you from enjoying that. There's a reason that you like it so much, and you should continue to celebrate whatever artistic endeavor you love pursuing. Now, one of the most useful tidbits that we get in this section that I'm analyzing today, that I will end with, is actually advice that Stephen King receives from a professional editor, a newspaper editor, that he works for while he is in high school. At first, Stephen King is not excited to work at the newspaper because he already did journalistic stuff in a way for his brother, and the school newspaper and the Village Vomit satire thing that happened. So when he goes to work with the professional, he's not that optimistic, but he soon finds out that he's going to gain a lot of skill and knowledge from this man. Mr. Gould, the editor, looks at one of the articles that Stephen King has written and then goes over it very quickly but very effectively, taking things out and crossing things and rearranging things. And Stephen King says in those 10 minutes when he watched that editor worked, he felt like he learned more than from any class in elementary school, junior high, or high school. So Mr. Gould's wisdom, found on, at least in my book, on page 57, says, when you write a story, you're telling yourself the story. When you rewrite, your main job is taking out all the things that are not the story. So Stephen King comes from a similar school of thought, I think thanks to his editor. Later on in the book, he talks about how his revision process, if I remember this correctly, is that he writes the first draft, kind of like Mr. Gould says, for himself. And by the time he's done with the second draft, the book's pretty well shaped up. And so you might only need a third or fourth draft. Most of that heavy lifting happens in that first and second draft. So that's up to page 57 of Stephen King's On Writing. I'm hoping to make more of these videos, so if you've never heard of this book before, I seriously advise that you check it out yourself, because I've just gone over a few tidbits, and obviously Stephen King is going to explain himself much better than I can paraphrase. But I wanted to walk some of my students through what we see on here and talk about what I admire. I would love to know what your favorite parts are and what you think of Stephen King's advice. And also, what do you think of Stephen King as a writer? Do you have any favorite books by him? Is it not your cup of tea? I'd love to know. So, leave your comments and I will be back with more Stephen King, hopefully sometime next week.